Hi.
Hello. We did a series a couple of months back on Johannes Greber. Not that many of our current viewers have seen that series, judging by the numbers, but in that series I was talking about the surprise I got when I actually read his book, Communication with the Spirit World, after leaving the Watchtower. A surprise was that many of Greber's teachings, which he said he got from the spirit world, were the same as I held as a Jehovah's Witness.
Yeah.
That was disturbing.
Yeah.
One of the teachings that he had from the spirit world that he wanted to communicate to the non-church world was that apostate Christendom was the state of the church as a whole. All the churches, according to his view, had departed from the teachings of the Bible.
And if you got that from the spirit world, why would they want you to think that?
Which relates to the subject at hand that you've read in our title for this video. That is, according to our way of looking at it now, a Watchtower myth, that Christendom is apostate. So why do we need to talk about this subject?
So in the title we asked why JW org will fall while the church will stand. That is set up or answered by a statement from Jesus in Matthew 15, and we're going to read that, 15 verse 13 and 14. I'm reading from the New World Translation, but David's reading from a different translation.
I'll read it
so
also.
He'll always comment on whether or not there's a difference. In reply, he said, "Every plant that my heavenly Father did not plant will be uprooted. Let them be. Blind guides is what they are. If then a blind man guides a blind man, both will fall into a pit."
Here the translations are virtually identical. This is not a translation issue. But this is a text we're familiar with if we're witnesses. We use it. And when we hear blind guides, we think of Christendom, the teachers of Christendom, the priests and the ministers, the theologians.
All false religions.
But when Christ uses the phrase blind guides here, is he referring to the blindness of the scribes, the Pharisees, his religious opponents in general? Or is he talking about a specific issue? And if you know the text, and I think you do if you're a loyal Jehovah's Witness, he's talking here about traditions. He's saying that what makes them blind is that they prefer the teachings of men, the traditions of men, to the revealed teachings of God.
Right.
But we shouldn't draw from that he's judging scribes and Pharisees, in fact Judaism in general, as being blind, because after all, under the traditions of men are the traditions of God, the Old Testament. The entire Old Testament, which is, of course, faithful teachers from the beginning. In Judaism, from Moses onwards, not just prophets, but wise men and the priesthood.
Obviously he doesn't mean that, because he quotes Moses, and he even says to his followers, listen to what the teachers say, but don't do. Like, so you, how does it go?
He says they sit in the seat of Moses. Listen to what they say, but don't do according to their deeds.
Right.
So he's not judging their teachings per se, because the scribes and Pharisees taught most of the truths of the Old Testament faithfully. But what they added to the truths, it was what they added to those truths that made them blind guides, because they preferred their own rabbinic traditions to what the Old Testament actually said.
Yeah, they expanded on it.
So he's not saying Judaism as a whole was unfaithful, because after all, Judaism brought together the Old Testament. It was the priests and Levites specifically who brought together the Old Testament. So in this text, we make the mistake, if we're witnesses, and a lot of Christians do this too, of confounding blind guides with the entire revelation of the Old Testament. If not that, then the scribes and the Pharisees as a totality are ruled out as being somehow unfaithful to God.
Right.
So what the question becomes then, is the plant that he says is not planted by the Father. Is that Judaism? Is that the Old Testament?
Yeah.
Or is it the traditions of men?
So did God plant Judaism?
Yeah.
And did God plant the church?
Yeah. So when we judge Christendom, and here's where Greber comes in, if we judge Christendom as a plant that my father did not plant, and ourselves as somehow the true plant that he did plant, then if that judgment is wrong, everything is wrong.
Yeah.
So what we have to do is evaluate what Jesus does say about the planting of God. Is the Old Testament God's? Is Judaism therefore God's? Is the Jewish people God's? Start from the beginning, and then we are in a better place to evaluate what the New Testament says about the church. So let's do that, but I think just go back 2 chapters to start the discussion, which would be the parables. In the 7 parables of Matthew 13, the first 2 parables are about sowing and about seed. So that might be a good place to start the evaluation.
Okay.
The parable of the sower is the first of the parables, and it's not that long. So we could read the parable itself and then the application Christ makes of it.
So I'll read verses 1 to 9, where he tells the parable. On that day, Jesus, having left the house, was sitting by the sea, and great crowds gathered to him, so that he went aboard a boat and sat down, and all the crowd was standing on the beach. Then he told them many things by illustrations, saying, Look, a sower went out to sow, and as he was sowing, some seeds fell alongside the road. The birds came and ate them up. Others fell upon the rocky places, where they did not have much soil, and at once they sprang up because of not having depth of soil. But when the sun rose, they were scorched, and because of not having root, they withered. Others too fell among the thorns, and the thorns came up and choked them. Still others fell upon the fine soil, and they began to yield fruit. This one 100-fold, that one 60, the other 30. Let him that has ears listen.
And now his explanation.
Right. That's verses 18 to 23. You then listen to the illustration of the man that sowed. Where anyone hears the word of the kingdom, but does not get the sense of it, the wicked one comes and snatches away what has been sown in his heart. This is the one sown alongside the road. As for the one sown upon the rocky places, this is the one hearing the word and at once accepting it with joy. Yet he has no root in himself, but continues for a time, and after tribulation or persecution has arisen on account of the word, he is at once stumbled. As for the one sown among the thorns, this is the one hearing the word, but the anxiety of this system of things and the deceptive power of riches choke the word, and he becomes unfruitful. As for the one sown upon the fine soil, this is the one hearing the word and getting the sense of it, who really does bear fruit and produces, this one 100-fold, that one 60, the other 30.
Now, before we get into the analysis of the parable, I guess we should play Let's Pretend. If we only had this one parable to determine the future of the Church of Jesus Christ, which after all, he says 3 chapters later in chapter 16, he will build and the gates of Hades will not prevail against it. If we only had this parable to predict or project the future of the Church of Jesus Christ, what would we think that future looked like? And based on how we react to that question would be the related question. What will be our attitude towards this entity we call Christendom? Because our judgment of what the church would be, according to the future that's shadowed by this parable, will determine our attitude towards this entity that the church thinks of as Christ's domain, and we think of, if we're trained as Jehovah's Witnesses, as the domain of other spirits. As indeed Johannes Greber does. So in the next segment we want to analyze the parable more closely.
Good.